All right. Hi, everybody. Welcome back after lunch. Was there enough food this time? Last time there wasn't enough food. Was there more or less? Yeah? Good. Oh. That's Emily for you. She was just like, there wasn't enough food, and therefore I have doubled the order of food. And it happened like in 5 minutes. I'm not really sure how she did, but thank you very much for making sure that. So I'm really delighted to introduce this panel. There have been so many discussions about the idea that robots are going to steal our jobs, for lack of a better way to phrase that. And they're informed by some pretty savvy people at MIT and elsewhere, sort of talking about why maybe the second machine age is different from the first machine age, and then you've seen some stuff that's very sensational. But if you think about what it means for many human jobs to be substituted by robots, that obviously has profound societal, legal, and other repercussions that go well beyond the notion that we're going to be unemployed, right? Or that capital will shift in some way. It's actually, it's going to have to be mediated by law. And so I remember that Dan Siciliano, who's going to be moderating this panel, and I had this conversation years ago, and Dan had this great example. I don't know if you intend to use the example about the payroll taxes. Are you going to use that example?
We're going to mention it, but you can.
Oh no, I'm not going to steal your thunder.
You may not get to it. So
okay, well, this is Dan's idea, and we're sitting there talking about this stuff, and it was like this real frenetic conversation where we're just sort of talking about all the great robot law possibilities like 6 years ago, and Dan was like, well, think about this, like if you were just take one job that a person was doing in a fast food restaurant in one state, and you were to automate just that one job very quickly, right? So just the one thing, you would move a tremendous amount of money from payroll taxes, right, to capital investment. And in theory, you could destabilize the tax base of a state. And so once states realize that that's possible and that their tax consequences are going to be different, right, they're going to get super interested in this. And then what I would say further is that have a hydraulic effect, and then we'll get people like Garry involved, because then suddenly companies will be feeling pressure from evaporating. The point is, it's this web, and if you pick any part of it out, the rest begins to unravel. So in order to tackle this complex question, we have a person in corporate governance who's a long-time thinker about robotics law as well, Dan Siciliano. And then we have Andra, and we have Garry. Garry, as you know, was Littler Mendelsohn and is a senior partner working in their robotics practice group that I've mentioned repeatedly. And Andra is a longtime Silicon Valley robotics champion and organizer and scholar in her own right, and a longtime collaborator of mine, but has specifically done research on this question of displacement. So we have deep experts. We had another expert slated for this as well, who looks at robot economics, but he was not able to make it. So, but I think that just means that we'll have more conversation among our panelists. So thank you very much, and I'll turn it over to you, Dan.
Great. I think the introductions were more than sufficient, although I encourage you to take a look in the program, because it spells out all the things that Garry and Andra have done. And with respect to Garry, you just don't tend to expect the word innovative, groundbreaking, then be followed by law firm. So, it's a good sign, I think. And of course, Andra's specific title, by the way, is Managing Director of Silicon Valley Robotics, an industry group. But I want you to read her bio, because you'll understand some of her interesting strengths and background, radio technician, film, you name it. So we'll get into that a little bit, because some of it has to do with the points we're going to raise. We have an unusual panel, because it's a free-form discussion panel. It's not based on a paper. That's in part because we think that we are in very early days about this discussion. In the last 6 months, several papers have come out. We'll reference a few of them, not the least of which is by the NBER. And it's a paper that I often recommend for those who are not mathy. I'll mention a few times. Just skip the math. Read the text, look at the pictures, you can get 90% of it that you need out of it. Well, with that, let me tell you a couple things that we are going to talk about and probably what we aren't going to talk about, and we'll go for about 45 minutes, and then we'll switch to just open-ended questions. I think that'll be the most productive. So we're going to look at trends within robotics as impact the economy from a macroeconomic viewpoint. So kind of parentheses, employment, national income growth, where we talk about the things that we think matter. Then we're also going to, along the way, highlight some interesting points about this impact in the context of labor and employment law, which is a subset really of the first topic, but its own interesting category because it surprises you again and again in the way it's kind of manifesting currently. And then we're going to dive into, a certain extent, the Luddite story, which is should we or should we not be afraid about the impacts on humans and our welfare as concerns income and employment with respect to this rise of robotic innovation? And is it the story of destruction but reinvention with better growth and wealth, or is it a different story this time? And I think we'll chat a little bit about that, give some evidence, but I think we're going to be most interested in what people here think about that. So with that, let me start with just a broad-based question, which is almost foundational, definitional, and that is, how would you, and I'll start with Garry, but we'll turn to Andra, how would you categorize and or characterize robotics for the purposes of discussion in the law and economy, which is sometimes a different way of categorizing and thinking about it than we have in, say, the kind of pure industry science side?
Yeah, that is a very helpful distinction. We really struggled when we as a law firm, and by way of background, I'm going to be able to draw upon the knowledge of 30,000 employers that we represent all over the world. And so I have access to data that is not readily available in a published format, attorney-client privilege, but gives me a lot of insight into what's happening. And we struggled with people in this room and in the robotics industry because we fell into the trap of comfortably referring to many things as robotics, only to find companies like KUKA Robotics very upset with us because we weren't really talking about robotics. So we applied our thinking to it and uniquely came up with 4 categories that intermix, but it's a way that we were able to track employment and labor law. The first category was traditional robotics, what you think of. It operates on its own. It has 6 axes usually and meets the standard definition of traditional robotics. Then we had cognitive computing, artificial intelligence, and the software that's associated with that. 2 additional categories help. Telepresence, telemanipulation, remote work is really an important area. Technically not robotics, but often called robotics, and a whole industry growing in that regard, and it ties right to the payroll tax because people in India or Argentina can be working in San Francisco on a daily basis by virtue of the technology available. The 4th category is really exciting, and that's wearables and human augmentation. The wheelchair disappearing from our society, what incredible power exists with the robotics and how it starts transforming employment and labor law issues which actually help promote that type of technology. So those 4 categories, almost everything we talk about will be a mixture of those 4, but that's what we use for thinking purposes.
Before I switch to Andra, I'm going to drop a hint of something we might get back to, and that is the non-obvious opportunities that arise, say, in employment law with even just the augmentation category. Garry and I had a conversation by phone in which we reminisced about the fact that once upon a time, and we're so glad we're past this point, law firms could think about not accommodating a lawyer who was blind because it might have been technologically quite challenging to do so. But now it's trivial, and it would be almost laughable for any law firm to say, I'm sorry, that's actually a difficult accommodation. And that's a function of advancement of technology. And so this idea under the ADA, Americans with Disabilities Act, of reasonable accommodation is radically expanded with the opportunities that are presented in the augmentation side of robotics, and it has a profound impact. So companies that don't think much about this will soon enough have to call you.
And when you think of the obligation to accommodate someone with a disability, there's a defense that an employer can raise that it's not practical, it's too expensive. You could accommodate just about everybody with everything if there was enough money to do so, hire somebody else to do their work. But the technology costs are changing, and exoskeletons is such a good example of it. And it is so emotionally satisfying to see somebody who couldn't walk for 18 years, who every year to every doctor indicated I will walk again, comfortably stand up and walk around the stage or around an auditorium by virtue of an exoskeleton, and the cost of those is coming down, not yet where it's a reasonable accommodation, but soon. And you're shortly going to see hundreds of thousands and then millions of these suits in use around the world.
So we'll come back to those kinds of examples, but first, maybe another kind of framing help for us. Andra?
Okay, and I'm going to reframe things a couple of times, and I'll just put my context a little more out there. Silicon Valley Robotics is the non-profit industry group representing robotics in the Bay Area. And my personal involvement in that came from follow-on. I was researching robots in terms of the rollout of robotics technology into society and trying to understand that. So I'm deeply curious about that broad area. And then I ended up centrally engaged in probably the largest robotics cluster, but in creating and shaping that. And I am just perpetually engaged in the question, what does that mean? Who is involved in this Robotics Industry Association? Who will be involved? How do we get them in? What does that mean in terms of the technologies? What counts? What doesn't count? Who makes those decisions and why do they make those decisions? So I'm going to give you many answers because the first one is usually just what is a robot? And that's really different depending on who is asking that question. And I think Garry has found that himself. So then the next question is, well, which industry? And for me, the stage beyond that is which stage of robotics is this? Is this research? Is this commercialization? Is this production? Or is this end use case? So we then have to slice it that way, looking at the gestation of a robotics technology. And I think the definition and who sets that definition is very different at a university level to at an employment level. And as an industry group, we are trying to be as all-encompassing as possible within our very specific framework to promote innovation and commercialization in the context of robotics companies in Silicon Valley. And one of the things that I actually found the easiest way to look at it sometimes was to say, who does it? Because I found that robotics is still small enough so that there were certain people that you could follow from place to place and go, whatever they're working on, it's probably something to do with robotics. They're a roboticist. They have a unique combination of skills and previous experience in what they build and do. It's led them into robotics at one point. And it's been quite interesting following people like Yogi Matsuoka and Sebastian Thrun, who've been instrumental in a couple of very significant robotics technologies, but have then moved on, rather interestingly to my mind, to things involving society, education, artificial intelligence. Yeah, not such a surprise. Robotics and artificial intelligence used to be hand in hand, and then there was a bit of a divorce, and now they're coming back together again. But Yogi Matsuoka used to build neuroprosthetics, very advanced robotics. Then she started Google X. Then she went to Nest. And now she's currently VP of Technology at Twitter.
She was on our faculty here at the University of Washington.
Yes.
Yeah, sorry.
Yes. And to me, that begs all sorts of interesting questions. If someone who is a top-notch roboticist goes from building wheelchairs and cars and real devices into all these other areas, why? What does that mean? So sometimes I have far too broad a definition of robotics because to bring it back to the industry, there is a very specific narrow one where you're tracking what is sold as a robot by certain companies. And that's a definition that currently is under threat right now. And as Garry found, it was not sufficient for what he needed to do to understand robotics. I certainly find the International Federation of Robotics, by and large, is the industry group that does robotics statistics. And it's really useful to refer to them to have a sort of apples and apples approach and understanding. But you need to understand that it really doesn't cover a heck of a lot that's coming up. And I was recently at the IFR discussions where they're trying to deal with the fact that service robotics and industrial robotics are blurring together, and it makes their categories become meaningless. And they don't know how they're going to tackle that.
And in fact, it highlights one of the things that we'll come back to thematically, which is we think that there is a challenge in understanding what the economics of robotics really means, because so much of robotics from an economist viewpoint is invisible, right? Because the units of measure that are typically the standards for purposes of either identifying the GDP or national income or personal income aren't readily mappable to what's happening in robotics, and it means that we don't have a good way of talking about it. It's going to take a while for it to sort out. So we'll tease out some of the areas where this is most obvious. The definitions that we received as kind of 4 parts, and then this idea of this broad expanse of following the people who matter, sort of, as identifying where there's emergent stuff, makes a lot of sense to us. So with that as a segue, let me jump to our kind of second question, which I think will probably generate some questions from everyone else, and that is, in the short to midterm, so 1 year, 3 years, 8 years, what identifiable trends within robotics as broadly defined do you think are going to be most impactful or most obvious? Those aren't necessarily the same thing. You can pick either way in terms of changes to the workforce, employment environment, or the economy. And let me highlight again, workforce, employment environment, and economy are 3 different things. They get conflated in most of the popular press treatment around robotics and the economy. People say, but they'll help the economy grow. That does not equal job growth, right? Or, there'll be a lot more jobs. That does not equal income growth. These are all different things, and so we want to kind of tease out the differences. But I think, Andrew, you maybe go first on this one?
Okie doke. The trends that really excite me, and I see these as emerging industries in Silicon Valley right now, are probably still a little bit too far off, and that's soft robotics, although I do think soft robotics is going to have a strong impact in the next 5 years in manufacturing, logistics, and agriculture.
Could you define that for us? We have a mix of people.
Soft robotics is the comparatively cheap and effective use of probably silicon-based, inflatable, hydraulic or pneumatically operated grippers or arms. And traditionally...
Big Hero 6, yeah. The short
Big
version
Hero
movie
6. Was inspired by a lot of work from companies that are working in soft robotics.
Most of those movies wouldn't be possible without robotics.
Yes, camera robots, film and television robots. Yes, it's
huge area.
Hidden and growing rapidly area. But the thing about soft robotics, if let's define ordinary robotics is a mechanical, is a hard structure with usually electric motors or gas motors for the larger robots, and they are dangerous. Industrial robotics to date all has to be separated away from people. And we're starting just now, and actually I didn't mention collaborative robotics, maybe Garry will.
But that's huge.
We're starting to develop sufficiently good awareness and safety-based systems to have compliant robotics that can work with people and alongside people. And the most effective form of that is soft robotics, where it's the inflatable structure of the end effector or the arm itself that is creating the skeleton. There are not the heavy moving parts. It's an inflatable robot hand or arm can go around your head without hurting your head. It has a natural inbuilt, it stops once it gets to a certain point.
You might still have PTSD after that, but you won't be hurt.
Now, just as a sort of leap there, this research was, some of the original research for this was done better for medical robotics, things that could operate safely in the human body. Now, that's not where it's being used right now, but this kind of soft robotics has incredible impact on manufacturing, areas of the manufacturing process that have been resistant to automation because it's been deformable materials. Things like food, things like textiles, things that traditional grippers could not work well with. It's also compliant, so it can be used as collaborative robotics working alongside humans more safely. It has potential for agriculture in areas where it's very difficult to have labour when you need it. I can talk a lot about soft robotics.
And what about in the next 5 years, though? Something closer.
So
Although
I think that's going to start having an impact in the next 5 years.
Okay.
It's only just commercialising literally this year. 3 companies are commercialising soft robotics, and this is 10 years' worth of research, but it's being commercialised this year. But before that, autonomous vehicles, we've had that 10 years' worth of research and 5 years' worth of work on commercialising it. The DARPA Grand Challenges really accelerated the development of certain technologies that were at a 20-year threshold point, and they brought them down to we can imagine it in a 5 to 10-year framework. So autonomous vehicles are something that will have a huge impact on every aspect that you mentioned in the next 5 years.
We'll come back to, we're going to dive into those a little bit, discussion, but let's get your list if there's...
Well, I certainly would agree on what's been said thus far, especially the autonomous vehicles as an area of growth which we see coming very quickly and impacting broadly many industries, truck drivers, but also the repair business, real estate. If you have an autonomously driven car, it changes how you get to work, where you have to store the car. It changes the whole concept of Uber and Uberization on demand. So that's one industry we're following closely. Probably the industry where there's the greatest immediate impact that is changing things on a daily basis is medical. From surgery to dozens of aspects of what a doctor does or a medical practitioner are now handled by forms of robotics, artificial intelligence, and the other items we've listed, including the remote access. I'll give you one practical example under remote access that just demonstrates how powerful this is. We have a major company that produces medical products, and with regard to these products, one of them is a 12-inch by 12-inch device that paramedics use on ambulances and take with them to calls. This device allows immediately tapping into the bodily functions of the patient and allowing a visual of the patient to be given to a doctor anywhere in the world, but could be at lunch, could be at dinner. You get to the right doctor and they can make a diagnosis and some immediate steps can be taken. The estimate right now is that 1,100 hospitals are using this technology, and they estimate 40,000 stroke victims would be dead today but for the use of this technology. So we're going to see massive change there. Probably the slowest area of change, but a trend, is, believe it or not, in the practice of law. I can tell you that in 5 years or 10 years, you won't recognize a lot of what we do. A lot of the routine functions are being absorbed by technology that hasn't quite become popular yet, but will. And we've been developing, for example, a technology that takes independent contractor status, and where a lawyer would normally be used to determine that status, the computer with substantial data and some cognitive capabilities answers that question in 90% of the cases, and when the 10% have to be looked at by a attorney, all the background information has been assembled. I think immigration saw this happen a decade ago, and now we see it happening in various forms of the practice of law.
There's a funny observation about this, Garry, which is that when you talk about sheepdogs being replaced by drones, half an audience goes, oh, they're kind of nostalgic and sad, as we discussed yesterday. When you say that a bunch of lawyers are going to be replaced by automated systems,
they applaud.
They just write that down. They're like, lawyers gone soon. You know, I don't know. There's a certain sort of pain that, ironically, talking about a law school. But what about, you had mentioned kind of persistent telepresence. Maybe mention that, and then let's
definitely.
dig into it. Yeah.
Well, the medical device is an example, but beam technology, there are probably 12 or 15 major companies that are promoting telepresence and telemanipulation to the point where almost any function can be done remotely. And there's going to be a big impact on government with regard to collections. Silicon Valley, where I am, San Francisco, with Andra, we have a heavy use of this technology now. Some of it may be receptionists, but increasingly it's to bring intelligence from anywhere in the world to focus on immediate problems that the employer has and work in San Francisco for 8 to 10 hours a day, but do it from anywhere in the world.
So
I actually wrote a report last year on telepresence devices, and it was an annual series. I was asked to write the 2014 one, and I went back and looked at previous years, and as you said, was able to list those companies and those companies, plus this one, plus this one, plus this one, plus are you going to count the little ones where people put their mobile phones on wheels and all the others, and realize that the trend as of quite recently was a proliferation of different use cases and different physical models of various telepresence devices, to the extent that you were looking at a real specialization for different verticals. So you had now, this is a telepresence for a medical situation. This is a telepresence for a social situation. This is a small telepresence aimed at consumers. This is a large telepresence device aimed at a business and enterprise use. And that suggested a maturity in the telepresence, robotics, and telemanipulation industry that I think is quite new.
So let's dig as almost by way of example. So it's hard for us to kind of have a broad and universal commentary on the macro impact, but we can take these two examples. Let's take maybe telepresence and driverless or autonomous vehicles and talk about them and their impact on the economy, because they're going to be big. And maybe, because we've got the chart up in part, let's start with autonomous vehicles. So in the United States, if you hop onto the Bureau of Labor Statistics website, one of the things that you'll find is that the jobs, full-time positions attributable to professional driving in the U.S. are about 6 million. That doesn't include the current up-ramp rate and their independent contractors from 0 4 years ago to what may be somewhere between 500 and 800,000 in another 3 to 7 years, Uber drivers, which are neither employees nor full-time on average, at 15 hours a week is the average. But it is a substantial portion of the employment economy. If you then juxtapose that with some kind of realities about number one jobs in various states, so we just kind of want to put this up there just to hit it home.
Play this from 1978.
And maybe narrate what it's saying, because it's a little hard to read.
Yes.
What you're observing.
It was bad news for secretaries. Okay?
So each state
And
had a
farmers.
number one job. And as an example, you had truck driver, as a dominant number one job emerging as of the 70s and then really dominating through the 90s and early 2000s, and still number one job.
Overall, but the emergent...
No, we'll do it again.
The emergence of software as... Maybe I can slow it so we just leap from one point to another. Yeah, okay. 1978. I'll do this manually. We see that farming is still a very large... and machine operator. Probably, it's pretty much 1/3 farming, 1/3 machine operating, and 1/3 secretaries.
Just to point out, those states are very sparsely populated.
Yes. No, this is not a proportional impact. That's absolutely the case. Yeah.
There is a lot of problem.
The light green is farmer.
Midsection.
And just as a note, one of our lenses that we're using here is who are likely to be the agitated and or activated political actors. And political action tends to happen at a local level. So it's true, while Idaho may be a relatively low population state, or Wyoming, what will happen, though, is the legislature of Wyoming will say, we lost 4,800 jobs. And for those of us in large urban populations, say 4,800 jobs, geez. But in that place, legislation and or tax policy and or a number of things may emerge, which then others look at. So it's almost a lens, not a population impact.
Yeah, in fact, we have one more map at the US that talks about industry sectors, which I think ultimately is more useful. But in terms of understanding these specific factors, this is cherry-picked. It is the most commonly described position in each of the states over the period of time.
And certainly probably does not amount to the highest paid or the highest aggregate income for the state either, right? These tend not to be high-paid positions.
So, from the start of it, farming, secretary, machine operating, jump forward. What we start to see is a reduction in machine operating, an increase in secretaries. lots more secretaries. It looks like around about 1986 was peak year for secretaries. Now we're seeing a few more truck drivers as opposed to machine operators, so those manufacturing belts seem to have shifted over into logistics and away from manufacturing as their primary thing. Farming and secretaries still pretty dominant. Truck drivers increasingly. Secretaries disappeared. Farming, it's been a slower decline. Farming was already largely automated. So we have some emergence of service industries as cooks start to appear in some of the states. Computer analysts in 4 different states show up for the first time. And those were the blue ones. And some of them, this is so little I can't see it, but every time I try and blow it up, it just blows up all the ads and the text. So I'm sorry, we didn't plan to show you this, so it's just take what we can get. Primary school teachers, retail clerks, nurses are popping up, cashiers, software developers, and we've reached 2014.
And yet, in 2014, you'll notice that truck driver is still the #1 dominant, most common job, and it's just because there's a lot of it.
And highest number of positions vacant, from what I understand from Bureau of Labour Statistics. It's a job with demand for more people.
Which means the return on invested capital, robotics or otherwise, however we want to define it, the yield is going up. The return is going up because there is, in fact, demand. And this intersects with both immigration issues, overall labor employment issues. And one of the things that I think we can say with modest certainty, but without certainty around the timeline, whether it's 5 years or 10 years or 20 years, it is unlikely that you will have individuals driving taxi cabs or cars. Maybe you have to go to 25 years, depending on how you think about this. But somewhere between 5 and 25 years, that's 6 million, plus there's an ancillary 4.5 million jobs related to servicing those industries. Those jobs disappear. And we'll get to our last question in just a little bit, which is, when those jobs disappear, does it happen faster than it did previously in history? Yes, the agricultural reduction from like 70% to a little less than 1% now took 2.5, almost 3 full generations. This will be 1/2 of one generation that you see this change. So it's very rapid. That may have an impact. And the question is, do we end up with other jobs in other places? And it's an open question. But what do you,
Well, if we look at the last 100 years, even though we've seen significant shifts in the jobs that are out there, we haven't seen significant changes in the unemployment rate. And to my mind, that's the best we can do at predicting the future forward. And while it looks like things are changing faster, I think that sometimes there is still an innate human pace to the rapid change. I mean, I think we've been talking about how rapid change is for quite some time. It seems like, yes, it's accelerating, but I think that if I look back at these maps showing change, I go, oh my goodness, that happened really fast. And I don't remember feeling like my world got turned completely inside out and upside down over this period of time. And sometimes perhaps I did live through the rise of the personal computer and the internet revolutions, and I sat back and went, well, that hasn't actually made significant changes. It's one of the reasons I'm very interested in robotics, because I think we have opportunities to make significant changes in our lives and in the world, for global good.
Well, if I can give you a perspective that you probably can't find in the literature yet, we are seeing what employers are really doing today and what their plans are for the next several years. And a lot of the changes were predictable, and technology was moving them along, but in a very definable way. And there was value in looking at what had happened during the past 10 years to predict what was going to happen during the next 10 years. 2010 is the benchmark we used, and it's about when we formed this practice group. It changed. The speed of disruption substantially changed. There is no major corporation in the United States today that doesn't have a thinking group or a functioning group that's working on the use of one of the 4 technologies, and probably all 4 that we've described, in their future planning. I'm sure everybody in the audience has referenced at one time or another the Oxford Martin study, which was the more recent study, regardless of how it was done and the perfection of it, it points to a general trend, and that is they took the 700 plus job categories in the United States and projected them forward either 1 or 2 decades and indicated 47% of them would be done by computers and robots as opposed to people. Again, that doesn't translate into unemployment, but it does translate into disruption. And there is a significant difference between the disruption that's occurring now and the speed of disruption and what's happened in the last 10 years. We fall into a fallacy of thinking, it's the nature of being human. We think about the future in terms of what we've experienced in the past. And we think that we think back to 10 years ago and look at that rate of change and try to apply it to the next 10 years is so fundamentally wrong. And we, as a practical matter, a law firm, are inside the corporation seeing what's occurring, and so we're looking at what's the effect on people. Do we have the necessary skills available? What are the legal constraints that are going to govern the reduction of force that takes place? As the new technology comes into the workplace, what kind of safety requirements are required? And where are they coming from? We have an entity in Washington, D.C., the Workplace Policy Institute, where we're working with the Congressional Robotics Caucus. And I trust all of you are familiar with the Congressional Robotics Caucus in the United States. But they're a bipartisan group that is looking at these issues and getting ready with regard to regulation and legislation. In Europe, we're already way past that. The Robo Law Report came out a few months ago. It was the product of a grant of $2.5 million from the European Parliament, and its purpose was to define what regulations and laws were needed in Europe for the oncoming technology. And all of that encourages us to start laying the foundation for a practical application of the practice of law dealing with these technologies.
Just to put some brakes on that, though, I mean, I think it's scary to think that Moore's law can be applied, or, you know, that growth law can be applied to the changes in society, definitely. But robotics is usually put out at the front of this. And while I think robotics is the leading edge of the new technologies, it's actually computerization.
It's computerization
that's making the bulk of these changes. And we can see that already. So I actually think that there's going to be inherent brakes put on the pace of change, because it's hard to produce a lot more robots or a lot more smart roboticized devices, and it's hard to get all of those devices and products out there in the world. We've seen the uptake for autonomous vehicles. It's still a slow step by step, and this is partly through regulation, but it's also partly through the physical limitations of getting devices out there. If anyone remembers, Terry Gao from Foxconn predicted 1 million robots in his factories. He said this in 2012. And everybody in robotics went, really? Do you know how many industrial robots there are in the world? In 2012, there were 1.5 million. So he was effectively planning to double the number of robots, and he said he'd do it by the end of 2014. Now, it took 30 years to get 1.5 million robots out there. He didn't get 1 million robots out by the end of 2014. It's been a much slower curve. Now, admittedly, China is building more and more factories to build robots. They're stepping into the game, not just as the largest user of industrial robots, but they could well become the largest producer of both industrial and other robots. But as I said, I think that there is a natural break in some ways on the physical process of rolling out stuff. And it's the big change, the fast change, has been on the computerization and the communication level. I'll just flick through the last of the... this is major industries with highest employment by state from 1990. So, and I think it only goes to 2013 period, so it's less than 15 years, and I find the pace of change here incredible.
So the blue is manufacturing, the red is retail, professional is green, and then accommodation
and food services is basically Las Vegas. And we're seeing healthcare and retail. Retail is
Healthcare is
getting
orange.
bigger and bigger, and healthcare is orange. Manufacturing is disappearing, and then so is retail. The majority industry with the highest employment by state is now healthcare and social assistance.
So let me try to kind of weave this a little bit together, and then we'll go for another 6 or 7 minutes before flipping to questions. And I do want to have us talk a little bit more about the telepresence, even though we've defined it outside traditional robotics, but it's obviously a good topic. So first, I think we all agree, and we can say that rate of change of economic and employment displacement is accelerated. You can't naturally conclude that that means more unemployment, but you can observe that, in fact, it is happening faster than has happened in the past. There's also this idea, to summarize, that you get through computerization, automation, and eventually robotics, but first you get a geographic untethering of certain type of work. So the good example, a lot of people don't realize this, when you pull up to McDonald's and you order and you're talking, if you do through the drive-thru, you're on average now, depending where you live, not talking to someone inside the store. It turns out that that's a highly specialized skill, and it's much better to have someone centrally located who can do it. And in certain places, there's an aspiration to run your license plate, ID your car, and know what you ordered before, so they have a lower rate of error, so they can plug it in. So a lot of those kinds of things, as soon as you untether, we know that that's predictive of potentially fully automating. Because if you can untether, then it has certain characteristics that allow you to automate. So we understand that's happening in a lot of places. And then something that I'll mention, but if you read the Kotlikoff Sachs paper, it's very clear. It's worth reading just for the literature review. And that is the share of national income overall that is a function of labor is declining. And it has been declining for a long time, and it continues to decline. And so that doesn't reflect on employment. It just reflects total wealth and income as a function of the economy. The part that is generated by human labor is going down. Now, you can have the economy growing very fast, and that total income can go up, and maybe even the part generated by labor can go up, but as a function of the overall, but it's not, as it happens, but as a function of the total economy, it's becoming a smaller and smaller part, and that's an important trend to keep in mind. So with that in mind, I want to switch to the telepresence and highlight some of the effects at an economic fiscal policy level. So H-1Bs. I'll make the one prediction, which is H-1Bs. Everyone knows what H-1B is, immigration? Okay, we hit the cap. It's a full-blown lottery this year. We hit the cap last year. There's political resistance to increase the cap. You can feel different ways about that. But it turns out that if you're a technology company and you need brain power from
which you
far
do,
away, you need it. It turns out that the price point for sophisticated telepresence, beam technology, for example, is now about the same price as a complicated H-1B case. And so you say to yourself, well, my goodness, perhaps I should have lots of these. So by 2020, 100,000 units a year from just one company.
Just one. There's so many more. I'll give you a recommendation on company to watch that was invisible 4 years ago. The two leading companies that do remote work, Elance and Odesk, combined together. And the statistics are startling. They bring a total of 600,000 skilled workers to work every day for roughly 200,000 entities in the United States primarily, but the individuals come from all over the world. And work is changing. From an employment and labor law standpoint, it's dramatic. What is the law that governs working conditions for someone who works 8 to 10 hours a day in San Francisco, California, but is located in Argentina? Are they able to take advantage of California's laws? There's a worker that isn't doing that work and paying taxes in California, so the state is looking at it.
They also happen not to be buying lunch, gas, or homes in California either, by the way.
That's absolutely
economic
true.
growth viewpoint.
But filling a need for jobs that are actually very much available and unable to fill them. And with the security concerns and the limitations on HB1 visas, this becomes a totally workable arrangement. This type of technology will come ubiquitous and distance will be less. And we are looking at all of the employment and labor law implications. And we're about to issue a major report on that, which you'll find on our website. It's not quite available for publication yet, but tracks in about 13 areas of employment and labor law what the effects will be of looking at each of the 4 categories we've identified.
And let's highlight the macro path here. So if you think about it, if you had jobs that would have been high-skilled immigrant labor, but instead you substitute with either technology a la ELANS or more advanced telepresence technology. So
And
it expands the scope.
telemanipulation.
And you have the ability to use that talent from outside the country. 2 things happen. One, you either contain or reduce costs as an enterprise. So the returns to capital are increased, so the enterprise earns more money. Second, the labor income, probably at a lower income point, the labor income is accrued outside the country. So the earner for that income is not inside the United States, and hence that means that that's not attributable to either national income or labor income. And so you've done 2 things. You've actually increased the return to capital where the enterprise has more of the share, arguably, and secondly, the part that was labor share is no longer counted in ours. So this is a very important function that's driving down the share of labor income in the United States. And it's a trend that can only accelerate. If one company thinks that they're going to ship 100,000 of these units, about half of which will be in the United States, that's 50,000 units a year starting by 2020, and they're one of 15, even if they're the market leader.
I think they're not the market leader.
And so if you just do kind of a market share analysis, you quickly realize that the impact of telepresence in that manner will be 2 or 3 times the impact of H-1Bs right now. But it doesn't have any of the advantages of the H-1Bs. They neither live here nor consume here. They're more easily poachable. There's security risks, and that national income is no longer in the United States. So there are, I think this will probably attract attention at a macro level soon enough. I'm worried that it'll attract the attention of anti-immigrant politicians who will want to ban that too. But we'll have to see where that goes. So let's go to the last question, and we're going to address it very briefly and then open it up for questions. And that is, we have the observable historical pattern, pretty consistent, where you have technological innovation, massive disruption, dislocation, unemployment, but the creation of wealth through enhanced productivity, the driving down of consumer costs, so lots of people benefit. And then after pain, sometimes riots, sometimes revolutions, after much distress, you have the creation of whole new industries, much more employment, and much more income. We've seen that several times, sometimes slow, sometimes fast, sometimes painfully. So the question is this different this time, and why? Or is it the same? Should we expect the same? Should we have the optimistic view? Who wants to go first?
I will be happy to start this discussion. Every indication in the next 5 years to 10 years is that the traditional and historic pattern will largely replicate itself. That there will be much faster dislocation. There'll be temporary periods of unemployment. There'll be skill problems that are much more intense than what we've had in the past. But probably unemployment will not be really that adversely affected. The economy will do fine. There's so many new products and ventures that come out as the technology takes over dangerous jobs, unwanted jobs, picking fruit, and more manual labor. But at the same time, there's a curve that's building, and the conceptual computing model and all the other technologies that will increasingly take on work that's far more sophisticated, so that if you go out 20 years or beyond, there is a profound effect that's going to have on the economy. The 40-hour work week there's nothing magical about it. First of all, nobody in this room gets away with 40 hours a week.
Except for the fact that it's disappearing for us. We don't.
Yeah, that's right. And I don't think you can look for too much relief in the future, except you'll be amazed what will be available to you on the computer that you have to do yourself these days, but you will be able to create it. This means you've got concentration of wealth problems that society is going to have to address, or it'll come apart at the seams. But you also have a whole change in what is going to constitute our purpose in being part of our society, in what makes self-worth out of ourselves. Will it be our jobs? Not as much. As we migrate to other forms and make all of it come together, it's going to be a very exciting future. At the same time, you've got abundance. The technology revolution is going to enable us, if we can figure out a way of getting it there, to bring immediately the bottom 2 billion people out of poverty and create a whole different world. If you go to some of the worst areas in India, you should count the number of cell phones that are present. The Economist, back about 3-4 weeks ago, had a cover story on the fact that they predict by 2020, 80% of the adult population of the world will have a supercomputer in their pocket, namely a cell phone, with the apps that are associated with it. And the world is going to change substantially, and I think that's the exciting future we face.
Okay, that was positively happy. That's good. Okay.
I'll
Same
just,
theme? I don't know. Go ahead.
two things. One is very pragmatic. While I think that we have an opportunity to reshape the world significantly, and I do think it's a concern that capital is being concentrated and that there is huge wealth inequity. We also have, we need to produce more food, and we have an aging population. For me, these are two fundamental areas, and the third, just dangerous, dirty, dull, dangerous jobs. The fact that when we have technologies that are capable of minimizing some of the harm in some of the jobs that we have, I think we need to focus on putting it there. If robotics focuses on dealing with food security, dealing with assisting aging populations and developing a social quality of life and harm minimization, then I don't think that, I think that's a good thing for the technologies. Harking on what Garry said, I was at the demo recently, the demo that was the Douglas Engelbart, the opera about Douglas Engelbart's famous demo at Stanford, which unfortunately had technical problems, and we had to wait for quite a while for it, unlike Douglas Engelbart's demo. But it was preceded by a discussion between Jaron Lanier and Sebastian Thrun. And they talked each about their epiphany points. And I was fascinated by Sebastian Thrun's because he said at a certain point, he decided that there was nothing interesting about making machines smarter anymore, that there was a heck of a challenge in taking the same automation and making humans smarter.
I think I'm going to throw out a point, and then we're going to open up to questions because we haven't covered a lot of things. And the point is, I'm going to take it from the practice of law, where I spent a lot of time studying lawyers' behaviors in face of automation. One difference to add to that is I think the displacement that has occurred historically has generally occurred with moderately empowered to disempowered populations within the economy because it was a lower skilled elimination. And our experience over the next 5 to 20 years will be very different. And just take lawyers as an example. Lawyers are fairly empowered. They tend to be relatively well off, and they do not go quietly when, in their mind, mistreated. And if you look at what's going to happen over the next 5 to 20 years to lawyers, they're just going to get whacked upside the head. They'll be faster, smarter, richer, and many, many fewer. But the culling will cause them to fight back. And so I think we're going to see more vocalized disruption and more angst as we go
We have
through
a
the
law
process we
firm,
just discussed.
a practicing law firm, so I can talk about what's happening today. In our Knowledge Management Center, we've created something called the K-Smart technology. It allows us to bring our cost to the client down by 25%, increase our margin by 25%, and all of that's on reduced number of hours needed to do the work because the technology brings it together. If you think this is something too far in the future, then I'm going to pull you back 10 years ago when we had a massive shortage of pharmacists in the United States. And technology came to the aid of that effort, and smart computers and robots took over filling prescriptions. About half of all prescriptions in the United States today are filled by robots with smart intelligence built into them through various software platforms.
Very pleased because the moment you hurry a human pharmacist, the error rate becomes significant.
The error rate
and that
is
very
magical.
Dangerous.
The error rate of a pharmacist that's human approaches 1%. The error rate of the technology is 0. It's virtually 0. It doesn't make mistakes. And that alone becomes an argument that's going to move us in that direction.
So let's open up to questions or comments. And we had lots more points, but, let's turn it over.
So many things to say.
Shy. It can't be the first panel that doesn't. Okay, there we go.
I'll just throw in a couple of things there. I'm sad to think that lawyers are actually going to be eviscerated by, and I would argue, computerization. No, I am not lying. Why am I not lying? Because one of the reasons I'm excited about, one of the reasons I'm interested in robotics is because, you know, I came through film and television as a woman. I was in the Robots and Rocket Club as a child and wanted to be an astronaut as a girl. I was always not right at what I did. And robotics remains one of the most gendered occupations, second only to finance. And I look at the pattern of women moving into various workforces, and medicine and law are the two that really opened up in
That's
the
true.
60s and 70s. So, yes, I am sad if law is losing its jobs
Well,
because
to
women
make
will
you feel a
suffer.
little bit better, the work the lawyer will be doing will be much more interesting and draw on their cognitive abilities to a much greater extent.
No, this is true. The lawyers that are left, and also I think in every industry, will be
Women.
happier. Well, yeah. and those women will be happier because they will be operating at a much higher level. We may need only 1 out of 10 or 1 out of 5 that we have right now, but everyone who's left, and maybe we'll get to this, but we talked behind the scenes about what we think is the emerging bespoke economy, like the sign of like wealth and clever consumerism in 20 years will be that you buy things made by a human, designed by hand. Think Etsy plus high-end 3D printing and easy commerce channels. And so, you know, people of means will say, oh, no, that table was made by Joe. He lives in a suburb of Oregon, and he's, so, you know, we think there'll be kind of this...
On his
strange
3D
explosion.
printer.
That's right. On his,
And if you get tired of just one button ordering it via Amazon and having
That's
it delivered
true.
via drone, you will have the luxury experience of shopping direct to a human.
And fancy hotels will brag that, you know, you will be received by a human. Our concierge is a person.
And your
the
robot will
housekeeper
look like a
actually is
human.
person. Yeah. Anyway. So.
And the low-skilled jobs will be looking after the robots that are doing all the work, which is just going straight back to Metropolis and RUR from the 20s.
We have a crowd now. All right, we'll
Yeah.
start here.
Dave Aragon from UW Electrical Engineering. I'd like to see how what you've concluded or kind of envisioned about remote work and telepresence. How those things would be affected, or how you'd if it would change anything from your point of view, if I kind of rip up what you said about H-1 visas, because having worked in Silicon Valley for about 30 years, I would allege, and I'm exaggerating a little for effect, but see, now I've gotten going on this, that there never was a shortage of engineering labor that couldn't have been fixed within a couple of years by allowing salaries to rise a little bit. That the schools around there, and then if necessary, all over the country, all over the Western Hemisphere, are perfectly able to produce, and people love to do that kind of work, but not so long as you perceive that after 3 or 4 years on the job, you're either going to top out in salary if you're an American, or be sent back if you're on an H-1 visa. And the free market could have fixed this a whole long time ago had the leaders of the industries there really believed in the free market and not gone whining for increases in this essentially scam to bring people over here under difficult conditions and thereby hold down the wages in both countries. Now, supposing that you kind of took that approach or believed that that was the purpose that the H-1 visas had been serving over time, and that that's the reason for what was originally conceived of as a temporary situation to be relieved by temporary visas, has gone on for 30 years. If that is true, or mostly true, then what would telepresence or remote work, would you kind of not expect the same people to do the same things for the same reason when given a new tool?
I'm gonna let Garry answer the telepresence question, then I'll
Oh,
turn
no,
to you.
this one's
the,
you.
the one, you can always trust H-1B discussions to generate discussion. It's a tried and true strategy. So the very short answer is, I think that regardless of how you think about the wage impact framing for H-1Bs, you can probably assert that industry itself, especially highly pressured industry that has to answer to shareholders and is looking to contain cost in a short-term time frame, right? You've described a low equilibrium where your purchasing power and your supply gets all screwed up for the long run. But I would allege that a lot of technology companies, let's characterize technology companies, are stuck in a bind in that in the short run they're just trying to reduce costs however they can, which in turn is going to drive certain behaviors, whether it's H-1Bs, good or bad. In your characterization, bad, I don't mind that, but also telepresence. I actually think telepresence is going to be simply a path to tapping talent at a reduced cost. If nothing else, and this is why I want to turn to Garry, if nothing else because the rules and regulations around labor and employment in the United States add a certain amount of cost. Now, they provide for lots of advantages as well, but they add costs. And so if you can get all the talent without having the person physically here and avoid, and that's a big and, right? You're going to end up litigating that for or against one way or another. Then you have huge cost savings. And that huge cost savings is going to attract a strategy. And I think that strategy is going to be the adoption of telepresence. Is that, you're actually engaged in these discussions right now.
We are engaged in it right now, and our clients, there's no technology company we represent, and we represent most of them, that don't contend that there's an immediate skills shortage. If you look at the educational institutions in the United States, where 85% of the future jobs are going to be STEM related, they're producing about 35% graduates, and half of those graduates are not U.S. citizens with those skills. So there is that problem. We could correct it, and what's happening now is globalization. We used to be a law firm in San Francisco. Then we became an employment law firm in the United States. We couldn't practice that way today. We are a global law firm covering the world and are working with about 14 different countries on liberalizing their labor laws so that there's a freer flow of people around. And with telepresence, telemanipulation, the global pressures of the job market are changing, so that you get a much different kind of standard, and any one country that tries to block that effectively is going to be pushed out of this new world. So I think this is part of what we see coming, and with it, I hate to say this, will come serious regulations, a reworking of the tax effects, new legislation, and we may need more lawyers as opposed to fewer. So I'm glad to see some of you studying in that area.
I see. Thanks.
You may have a chance for those lawyers to make some very good money too, because you've been talking to people who probably told you a few years ago that their situation was also a temporary emergency, and kind of could have fixed it then, but now the people they hired for that emergency have to be sent back because they're H-1.
That's
they
right.
got to come to you again.
That'll be the interesting draw of telepresence, which is, it has no definite limitation. Yeah. Oh,
Yeah,
sorry.
David-
I promised. I promised.
I was just
Sorry.
thinking the
Sorry.
panel yesterday on passports becomes relevant because teleoperation, telemanipulation. I'm Australian. We started to do a lot of telemanipulation and teleoperation for mining activities. It remains in one geographic locale, but suddenly you're no longer at the dangerous part of the job. You're somewhere safer. But now we're starting to shift things completely out of the area, and it really does raise an incredible number of issues that haven't yet been dealt with.
Well, as highlighted yesterday, you're essentially allowing people who would normally have to walk through a high security screen to be inside past that security screen, and their security is simply walking in their front door if they're operating from home, for example. And so I think these will be things
that's a whole nother area.
Yeah, it'll be huge, as was discussed yesterday.
Yeah, thank you. David Hendry from the UW Information School. Just a question about global warming and the environment and sustainability. I'm wondering if you could bring that lens into your analysis and comment upon how the change in labor markets and telepresence might affect the story around global warming and sustainability.
Very good question. We need telepresence to bring in the right expert.
Or autonomous vehicles potentially, because if you look at the chart that showed truck driving as the major occupation was because it was resistant to globalization. It required physical presence. It was the transporting of physical goods. Some of the arguments for, I'm quite excited by the possibilities for autonomous vehicles, not the cars for the consumers, but the transport of freight, whether by plane or by platooning of trucks. It has huge fuel savings. It's vastly more efficient, so it's reducing. And I think as we get smarter about understanding where demands are, we stop shipping things as much. We can start to do more in terms of local productions. Again, this is more automation and computerization than barring the autonomous vehicle part. And I'll throw one more thing in there. In agriculture, more robots on farms, the robotics systems that are being developed relate to some things that, say, reduce the amount of methane produced by animals by better moving them and their waste products around, just one little thing.
Very sexy.
By changing the footprint of agricultural equipment. As agriculture automated, it got bigger and bigger and bigger. And this has had a negative impact on its effect on the ground, literally. It's big, heavy equipment does not do good things for the ground. If you have a lot of small robots that are able to do the same job of watering or harvesting or something, they don't, I believe it's estimated that somewhere between 10 to 25% of agricultural land is wasted as vehicle pathways that can't be grown on. And so I think all of those things can change environmental impact in
Just
ways.
to make this very, very current, many of you are probably aware that the Federal Aviation Administration has proposed rules on small unmanned vehicles, but basically drones. The comment is due February 24th. The number one use of drones today is in agriculture, and the water usage and pesticides can be reduced by as much as 50% with the drone technology we currently have by allocating it where it's needed instead of on some type of a schedule. As far as global warming, I wish we could solve that problem here. I don't think we'll be able to. But the world is working on it, and even though there are endless flaws connected with this recent agreement with China, it is a symbol of what's going to happen, which is a worldwide agreement and then worldwide pressure to bring that under control, that no one country is going to be able to solve that problem, no matter how good the technology gets.
And since Colin's not here, I'll wear my economist hat and throw out one theoretical framing for this, which is, if you remember Econ 1, you remember the story about Giffen goods. They're an unusual good that as their price increases, people allocate more of their income to buy it. It's normally kind of a story of poverty and desperation. But luxury goods, ironically, in the literature and theoretically, are closely related, because luxury goods, as your income goes up, you buy more of them and you consume more of your income buying luxury goods. I think the risk to sustainability in the big robotics revolution is that the things that we just described, which are good, still drive down costs. As costs go down, demand expands, and so you can't outrun the lower costs equals greater demand and more aggregate consumption, unless you end up with this unusual bespoke economy, which is, there's no word for it yet, but it's kind of like a postmodern, positive Giffen good, which is to say, as the price of something interesting goes up, so you could buy the now $1 kitchen table, which was made in an automated way and transported in a super efficient way, or you could buy the $5,000 bespoke designed table, and that means you'll probably buy that one and keep it for 20 years, and you won't throw away the other one and just buy a new color in 7 months. If that happens, there's some discussion in the kind of blogosphere about this, then you have a different path even as costs go down. But otherwise, historically, costs go down, demand goes up, consumption is aggregately increased, you don't have sustainability, which is, I don't mean to be a downer about it, but I think we had this side.
Hi, I'm Karen Levy from NYU. Thanks a lot for sharing your perspectives. It's obviously incredibly important issue, and so it's great to have your perspectives on the types of change we'll expect to see. I wanted to ask you to drill a little bit harder into some of kind of, you mentioned like these transitions often come at cost or, with pain, and, the costs are not equally spread across populations. So I wanted to ask a little bit more about some of those effects. I'm working on a little hypothesis that as we see the proliferation of optimization technologies in the workplace, and also technologies that are meant to increase accountability, so actually this reads pretty well with the operator signature paper that we just heard about, that the net effect of those things is that we see risk and costs being internalized by workers that used to be borne by managerial and organizational structures. So not all of these are robotic, right? But certainly, algorithmic scheduling software, right? Like which makes work more precarious. There's this McDonald's class action right now going on, right, where workers were required to show up but couldn't clock in until the algorithm said the store needs you now, right? So they were being unpaid for a lot of that time. Even the Amazon suit that they lost at the Supreme Court, where in the name of loss prevention that used to be sort of borne at large by the corporation, right? Instead, we demand that workers stay unpaid, in order to go through the security apparatuses, ensuring that...
We litigated that case.
Oh, you did? Oh, okay. So you're the perfect person for me to present this to. So in light of those, and then some other stuff related to my work with truck drivers, actually, where you see truckers internalizing a lot of sort of the soft but very real types of work. So, not everything gets counted by these accountability systems. So things like doing their inspections and loading and unloading their trucks for which they're unpaid, are things that they end up doing kind of on their own time, on their, federally mandated rest time, which is problematic for everybody. I think there are a lot of examples of this. And I'm curious if there are either like legal stopgaps that you think could sort of protect against these, very real effects, on kind of wealth distribution, or if you just have another sense for how robotics is maybe the same or different from these algorithmic systems.
Well, I'll address the last area that you outlined as something that I really have studied and know a lot about. Our wage and hour laws were very inefficient historically, and the violation on the part of one worker didn't justify really much activity at all in the legal system. In the last 20 years, that has profoundly changed with class action litigation. And we look at the employers. What used to be really pretty shabby practices of what constituted our wage and hour laws is now being looked at through a microscope because litigation is so prevalent. And you can argue that's a misuse of our resources to invest it in the litigation, or you can argue, as happens in many class action areas, that, well, the given case may not be that attractive. The effect is higher compliance with the laws. I think in many areas what we're going to have to do is see similar enforcement tools used across the world, because there are a number of countries that don't enforce their laws in that way, and so you have now soft law developing with trade arrangements, compacts, charters from the United Nations that are all trying to create some standard regulation that hopefully will have a positive effect. And I think the technology that eliminates distance for all practical purposes drives some of the efforts to make common legal structures into which we fit. As I mentioned before, we represent so many countries. We worked with Mexico in their recent adoption, first time in 42 years of a labor laws. And part of it behind that is the enforcement of the new laws. So I'm optimistic, but there's going to be a lot of work for lawyers.
I think, again, this is one where the hardware robots are not going to have anywhere near the same impact that automation, computerization is having. And I think that is, for me, problematic because I like to try to focus on how things are moving for the good, but it's in this framework where I believe the balance for the increasingly on-demand, individualized work practices used to be unionization, and that's already pretty much gone away. So I'm not really certain how you can introduce that back in to be a balance, or if there is some new system I would like to believe optimistically, and I think I'm probably wrong because they said on the internet no one knew if you were a dog and what have you, and that just didn't pan out terribly well, that there are algorithms that can somehow compensate for this increasingly, as one individual we are powerless. As a connected system, perhaps there are ways that we can take some of the capital back and take some of the policy back.
I think that's absolutely happening with social media and the things that activities anywhere in the world that would be quite despicable are now capable of being viewed just about everywhere. And the technology, access to it, I think that Economist article was right about its being ubiquitous. There's one example of how profound this is, and that was a situation a few years ago in two villages in Africa that had been untouched by technology, and they brought in these $99 computers, laptops with battery operations, and gave 100 of them into the two villages with no instructions, no electricity, nothing. 2 days, and the children had figured out how to operate them and were on the internet. And I think you added some comment to that I didn't know about, that there were actually a group of them doing hacking.
Confirming what we always knew about very young people.
And this doesn't show up in your poverty statistics. This technology's cost has come down dramatically and things are changing.
Feels like an unsatisfactory answer, but I think it was a good answer overall. Sorry, thanks. It's up to you if we can go for 3 more minutes to clear the questions. You tell us.
We have 10.
Oh, we have 10. Okay, great. Good.
David Bergen, UW. What are the chances that because of these disruptions, society will come apart at the seams? For example, affordable housing is a huge problem.
So I'll just throw out the historical context. So history has shown that concentrations of wealth, I'll give the caveat. So extraordinary concentrations of wealth are destabilizing. We know
right.
that. That's not really disputed. And then the question you have now is, do we have that kind of a concentration of wealth? And on the one hand, the answer is yes. We arguably have a concentration of wealth that has never been observed in the history of the world before. Not even royals 500 years ago had that level of wealth relative to peasants. Except there are 2 big caveats. One, survivability and overall quality of life in the places where you have the highest skewed distribution of wealth is relatively high. So there's a difference. If the really rich guy gets to live to 80 and you die a horrible, terrible death at 28, you're going to destabilize a lot faster. But the reality is that you may not live as wonderful and luxury-filled of a life, but you're probably not going to die miserably at 28. If you reach that level of disparity, it falls apart quickly. The second issue is, and this is eroded a lot, and this is from the immigration literature, the self-perceived aspirational opportunity to become the super elite is a huge stabilizing factor. So we shorthand that as American dream thinking, and if you are 15, 20, and 25, and you are relatively poor, but you think that there is a decent chance you can get from here to there, your tolerance for the entire arc of your life cycle of savings is really high for the disparity. If either of those come undone, then I think the answer is probably survey 20 social economists, and 19 of them are going to say, yeah, it's all over. But those 2 things have not completely come undone, so that's the caveat. But the inequities in terms of wealth are bigger. We live in the middle of that, but you may not even realize, if you look at the latest accounts, just in the last year, all the returns are going to capital. Capital, unlike income, capital is very concentrated, and the rate of returns to capital are going up. And the rate of returns to labor are not going up. And so it's actually an accelerating cycle, which, I don't know where it goes, but it's a very profound trend.
Yeah, I mean, it has all kinds of implications for the tax structure, the guaranteed annual income, negative income tax. One comment on housing, there's been tremendous progress made in 3D printing, and we're not too far away from houses being printed as opposed to built. And so hopefully they'll become a lot more available and less expensive.
Yeah, hi, I'm Mike Vanderloos, UBC. I had a question about globalization. I mean, this conversation this past hour has been, of course, hugely U.S.-centric. That's obvious and understandable. And, China manufacturing, field robotics Australia, and, regulatory pioneering in Europe, that's all fine. But what about Africa and resource-limited cultures where people are living at $1 or $2 equivalent a day? And so you mentioned the computers in Africa, of course, and there are some initiatives like, I think it's Robo Donkey, or I'm blanking on the exact term, some initiatives to put really interesting drone systems to circumvent infrastructure, lack of infrastructure in sub-Saharan Africa. I was wondering if you had any comments about macroeconomics of robotics per se in these other, if you will, cultures and economies that we know quite well here.
I can't remember the name of that project, but it's an interesting ongoing project for drones where the idea is for an aerial vehicle to do the same job that a donkey does. So it has to carry, I think, 20 kilos, and the goal is in 24 hours to be able to go around Mount Kilimanjaro, I think. And it's being done in stages. Nothing is at that stage yet, but each year they're looking at what technologies, who's able to get part of the way there. And I think we're reaching a potentially interesting inflection point, particularly for the African, South American continents, because miniaturization, low cost, the democratizations of technologies, if we're forecasting that 80% of the world's going to have access to mobile phones, then a lot more becomes possible. And we have people who are committed to trying to find technological solutions, and some of this comes from innovation from within, say, Africa, where they hacked together dual SIM card phones and made other creative adaptations of technologies that we weren't inspired to do, which leads to the point that I'm making about infrastructure. In many ways, the innovation that happens in the US is patching existing infrastructures rather than being completely, let's rethink how we do things. And so a company like Matanet said, well, let's rethink. And this comes to this idea of drones in areas where there are not roads or where you have seasonal roads and transport. Drones can do significant things, whether it's transporting medicines or messages, as can mobile phones, and completely change the way things happen somewhere. Whereas in the US, it's more like, geez, can we get Domino's pizzas delivered?
I think the democratization of information and knowledge is one of the great hopes for the developing countries. And if you look at the statistics on growth of the internet, obviously the place where the greatest growth can occur is the developing countries, and it is occurring. As that happens, we would hope that that's going to bring with it a lot of solutions, just as you described, that will help bring the poverty level to a different point. Abundance is a book that came out about 3-4 years ago, Peter Mathiason, and talks about the ability of technology in the relatively short run to eliminate poverty.
One infrastructure comment on physical grid infrastructure is very expensive, and we have good examples of skipping the physical grid laying process in the cellular phone industry, right? So if you were lucky enough or unlucky enough to go from a development viewpoint long enough without having a physical infrastructure for phone, then you got to skip a very expensive process. And I would point out that I think there's two other pieces that have to come into play for a lot of this to happen in a real robust way. And one is you actually have to have battery technology continue to improve and energy transmission. These are the two huge limitations. We know how to transmit information wirelessly. We can do lots of stuff. We aren't that good at, in theory we can, but we aren't that good at energy. And then once we get the energy wherever it needs to go, we aren't as good at having it last as long as we need. But as soon as those two things really get farther along, then it enables all sorts of other parts, which could arguably allow infrastructure grid skipping for whole areas, which will, I think, see the diamandis abundance, phenomena arise. But absent those two things, which I don't know enough about, but the people at Stanford who talk to me say there's hope, But boy, everyone's way too
And
excited that it's going to happen any moment, which just isn't going to
The
happen.
Google secret laboratory is working on battery
Well,
technologies.
that's what I'm always counting on. Is Google's pouring billions of dollars that we just don't know quite what's happening, and they'll pop out with like, ta-da, we did it. That's the optimistic.
So I think I wanted to change topics a slightly bit. I've got a question for Garry, though. Andra, I would love to hear your feedback as well. Your comments about Littler Mendelssohn's gains in efficiency by using intelligent computer systems really touches on something that I've been fascinated with, which is over the next 20, 30 years of the legal industry changing, sort of a shift in balance of power within the industry. And I've got three sort of ideas that I think work together, and I wonder if I could get the comments on them. One, which is the idea of how are these technologies going to be accessible to legal professionals? Is this the kind of thing that's only going to be available to large firms at first? And if not, large firms are sort of known for being a little bit inflexible. They take time to adopt technologies.
A little bit.
So I'm wondering if at the same time that doesn't open up space for smaller legal services providers to really leverage these technologies to make them more capable. But then at the same time, sort of how that changes the relative power of organizations, that kind of thing. I'm sorry, I'm short on time, so I'm not being super articulate.
Yeah. It is amazing in the last 5 years how much of the practice of law, and I put that in quotes, it's not what the Bar Association would call the practice of law, but legal information has become available not through law firms, but through dozens of other sources. The largest quote-unquote law firm in the world right now is LegalZoom, and becomes very accessible to people in every category. We have made a philosophical decision at Littler that significant parts of our practice are commoditized and will be absorbed by the information changes taking place. So instead of waiting for that to happen and guarding the billable hour until finally somebody beats down the fence that's around it, we're going the opposite direction, but it's not typical of law firms. And adopting that technology ahead of time, and as I said, bring down the cost to our clients and push up margins as much as we can while we develop it. But I'd say first and foremost is to be able to compete and provide that information and use the technologies that are available.
I think a challenge, whether it's for small firms or for large firms, and this is perhaps a broader topic, is to find the problems to solve. And this is harking back to the previous questions. And yet, I think we have the opportunities to drive the directions that technology goes by bringing problems to technologists. I think that's still something that doesn't happen anywhere near enough. And I see the startup side of it where trying to commercialize, you need to be able to find customers. And often that's not a well understood thing. There needs to be better connection between problems in the world and solutions in the world.
Connections to the technology in the legal environment is critical. We formed a company just recently, Compliance HR, and we are 50-50 partners with Neota Logic, which is one of the best platforms that lawyers use for the use of technology, computerized driven processes. And I think that has to happen, or the legal profession is going to just wither and be eroded from the outside as these processes can be done. We have found a drop-off in legal advice, and we monitor that more than practically anybody can as a percentage of our practice, and I would attribute Google as the primary entity responsible for that because you can get that much information. On the other hand, we have aggressively published, we publish 15,000 pages a year of material, some of our best advice, because we believe that that's, from an economic standpoint, should be available, and you become the trusted legal advisor and you make it up on the litigation side, and soon regulation. The problems that we've just touched on here are going to generate legislation, regulation, enforcement, and I think as long as there are people and problems, we will all be working hard no matter how advanced our robotics become.
Lindsay, do you have a quick question? We'll end on you. Yeah, we have just a couple minutes.
I want to say thank you for being here. This panel is fascinating. There's so much to talk about.
Incredible panel.
It is literally blowing my mind. It's a comment, and I just wanted to get some some comments back from you. The discussion here makes me think of some of Langdon Winner's comments. He was in an interview. He calls himself an innovation critic. And it's just kind of speaking from memory, his point was that discussing technology and robotics innovation as a way to solve all of our problems can be quite problematic, because what it does is it distracts us from the key issue, and it provides solution. And I wrote down a note. It's a strategy of evasion and delay. And so I just wanted to get your comments on that idea that we're jumping to making 3D houses, but we're not really asking why do we need those houses in the first place, and are we hiding from these deeper questions?
I think that's really insightful. Like I find Langdon Winner, and it's been a while since I've read his work, but I found him very influential, and I think this is something that at a micro level I look at quite a bit. We can get focused in on producing things for end users, and I'm always very interested in trying to insert that opinion as early in the process as possible. And I think a lot of people have expressed takes on that in the course of the 2 days at this conference. Things like design thinking, things like ethics, things like attaching ethicists to research and development, all of which are different ways of looking at, let's understand the whole problem first. But it becomes a rinse and repeat thing. It's always going to change and evolve, because as you develop one solution, then you start to discover problems and affordances and things that become created with that new technology that you hadn't predicted or understood. Many things can seem like they are a technology looking and acting in one fashion, but there may be a fundamental shift in what makes that technology work a certain way that actually allow it, under other circumstances, to behave in a completely different fashion. So I think some of these problems were raised in earlier panels in very interesting fashions. But I think, first off, we need to have better connections between the problems and solutions. Second off, we need to have better discussions about the big problems that we're facing and how to set them as challenges for the technology. And I actually think that's something that certain groups, governments, have done fairly well in setting challenges, whether it's individuals like Bill Gates or whether it's DARPA. But I think setting grand challenges is historically, and going all the way back to Napoleon, has been a very successful way of pushing technology in a socially driven fashion.
Yeah, it needs to be responsible, and you can get distracted by the technology. You should work to avoid that, but not eliminate it or not consider it as part of the solution. In terms of entities that are pushing the limits of where that can go, Singularity University, which is a very interesting structure, will effectively, some of the highest technology companies in the world will fund startup companies to $1 billion, but the startup company needs to be able to establish that it will bring a technology present that will solve a major world problem and affect 1 billion people. And so the more these efforts get undertaken, I think the better we'll see ultimately the society improve.
I just want to echo what Cincy said. This was just an unspeakably fascinating session. So thank you so much to the three of you. This was fabulous.